With a series of high-level engagements between China and Europe, where are relations headed? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Earlier this week, the Chinese President Xi Jinping met via video link with the Finnish President Sauli Niinisto. The two heads of state discussed their years of friendship and the future of a cooperative partnership. On Friday, President Xi held talks with the Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo in Beijing. He's there on an official state visit to China. While there, De Croo also attended the inauguration of Belgium's new embassy in the Chinese capital. CGTN's Yu Yang has this report.
Belgium's Prime Minister Alexander De Croo has wrapped up his two-day official visit to China, and this makes him the first European leader to visit China in 2024. On Friday afternoon, Chinese President Xi Jinping met with him at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. President Xi said since diplomatic ties between China and Belgium were established 53 years ago, cooperation across various fields has brought positive results and benefit the people of both sides. He said both China and Belgium are beneficiaries of economic globalization, and the two share a common interest in resisting protectionism and upholding free trade. She also spoke highly of De Croo's public statements, in which the Belgian leader has repeatedly opposed the idea of decoupling from China, and the Chinese leader said Beijing welcomes Belgian companies to invest and develop in the country and is willing to provide them with a positive business environment and more opportunities. The Belgian Prime Minister said the relationship between his country and China has a long history. He stressed that Belgium would continue to adhere to the One China principle and that his country is willing to engage in a frank dialogue with China, deepen mutual understanding, and promote stronger bilateral relations. At the same time, once again, he reiterated his opposition to decoupling from China. In fact, his visit comes at a time when Belgium holds the presidency of the Council of the European Union and can be seen as the latest example of frequent high-level interactions between China and the EU. Especially considering De Croo's visit follows the trip to China by European Council President Charles Michel and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who attended the 24th China-EU summit last December. The Belgian PM said when facing with turbulence and uncertainties, the world needs China and Europe to work together as partners to strengthen cooperation in promoting global economic growth, addressing climate change, and building a more stable international community. And he hopes his visit will help push China-Belgium relations as well as China-EU relations to new heights. Yu Yang, CGTN, Beijing.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Klaus Larres is a fellow at the Woodrow Center and professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. From Beijing, Gong is China Forum expert and professor at the University of International Business and Economics. From London, we are joined by Klisman Murati. He is the creator of the Global Power Index and the founder of Pareto Economics, a global world affairs research consultancy. Einar Tangen is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. Welcome to all of you. Einar, let me start with you. The Belgian Prime Minister, as we just heard, has just completed a visit to China, and then President Xi Jinping also met virtually with the Finnish President Sauli Niinisto. Look, I know these are only two countries, but are there any indication that Europe would like to improve relations with China, would like to forge its own relationship with China without any outside pressures? When I talk about outside pressures, remember when the US put pressure on European countries to restrict tech exports to China, as well as not to deal with companies like Huawei.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Europe is looking for some sort of economic reset, and obviously China is one of the prime partners for that. We're looking at a situation where this last half of the decade is going to be the worst in probably 30 years. The EU is going to lag the global growth. It's going to only be about 1.2%, and that does not figure in what is the damage being done in the Red Sea issues in terms of shipping and things like that. There's, also some concerns. Nord Stream, there's a lot of suspicions there, what happened. But, as the U.S. recently, day before yesterday, started buying Russian oil, and they doubled their order of uranium. This may not sit well with Europe, which in essence sacrificed because the U.S. was egging them on to cut off their cheap gas from Russia and instead buy very expensive gas from the U.S. So, at this point, there has to be some economic opportunity. And I think, Belgium is particularly good because even 2022, their trade with China went up over 30%. So I think Xi is strategically trying to have more engagement, as he's doing with the U.S. This is not about trying to hide things away. It's an opportunity to open things up.
Klaus, if we look at some of the earlier visits by European leaders to China, in April last year, the French President Emmanuel Macron, he and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, they met with President Xi Jinping. We had the Chinese Premier Li Qiang, he visited France and Germany, and then of course there was the EU-China summit. What is your view on how this relationship is growing?
Well, there actually has been a very active travel diplomacy between China and the Europeans. This is very true. And I think one reason is that both continents, both power blocks are suffering from economic difficulties. There are those in China, there are those in Europe. Mm-hmm. And of course, improving trade relations with each other would be one way forward. But all has not been too good in the relationship. When we look at the EU-China summit in December, that was not, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't a huge success either. The Europeans are complaining about the huge trade deficits the Europeans have with China. They accuse China of subsidizing particularly electric vehicles unfairly. They believe that needs to be rectified, and they still insist on reciprocity. They say there is a lack of reciprocity and China needs to deliver more. So they're right in saying we are more than willing to trade and to improve relations, but it needs to go both ways. Yeah. And that, I think, is the main demand the Europeans have. And I think the Belgian Prime Minister also repeated that today.
Just on the question of subsidies, European countries also subsidize their companies.
And it's very difficult to evaluate that. Von der Leyen has started an investigation into that. The report hasn't come out. It's very difficult to assess who actually subsidizes more. Almost every country in the world subsidizes its products. Who does more, who is more unfair than the other partner is difficult to assess.
I just want to get to one other point very quickly, if you can, please, and that we've seen in the past how vulnerable the European countries are to pressure from the United States, especially on strategic issues, strategic exports and things like that. Do you think that era is now over?
Not really. I mean, the United States has a clear interest in not exporting chips and military or dual-use technological goods to China. But the Europeans have a very similar interest. So it is not just pressure by the United States, so there is some pressure as well, but it is also in the interest of the Europeans not to export their valuable technology, which then China may exploit and take away or imitate or produce themselves.
But it is a two-way street, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
John Gong, President Xi has talked for a long time about people-to-people exchanges. China recently introduced a unilateral visa-free program for France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, as well as Spain and Malaysia. And shortly after that program was introduced, we saw a pretty sharp increase in the number of tourists from these countries that are going to China. I mean, how does this all fit in with China's goals to improve relations, particularly the goals that were laid out by President Xi?
Yeah, well, I think that initiative certainly has a lot to do with the intention to improve relations with the European Union. But other than that, I think it's also driven by China's own need to increase foreign visits. As a result of the 3-year COVID era, A lot of foreigners in China, living in China, have left. And certainly we would like to see more people come in and resume the kind of life they used to have before the pandemic 3 years ago. So I think it's driven by a couple of reasons, but it's good, as you pointed out, that these things are happening. I think people exchanges certainly contribute to better understanding between the two sides, as well as respect and future friendship, I hope. I also want to add that other than the reasons that the previous two panelists have discussed, I think there's one very important reason that's driving the prospective adjustment on the European Union's foreign policy vis-a-vis China. That has a lot to do with Ukraine. I think previously the entire Europe, or practically the European Union, nations are all reunited for the purpose of totally defeating Russia in Ukraine. But now I think realities are setting in that doesn't look like it's going to happen. I think we're seeing this stalemate on the ground, and I think this stalemate, if it can be maintained by the Kyiv side, is going to continue for some time. So I think the European Union politicians are realizing that this problem is not going to go away. Russia is not going to be defeated in Ukraine, and it's about time to start a negotiation process. And I think, and against that backdrop, the relationship with China, which is mostly viewed on the side of Russia, which is totally wrong in my view. This relationship is probably less pressured by the conflict, but this difference in interest in Ukraine, I think, between the Chinese side and the European side.
Yeah, good point. What is your view on that? Have European attitudes and views changed?
Not really. I think that is one of the bones of contentions between the Europeans and China, that China is indirectly supporting Russia, has doubled its oil purchases from Russia, and has still not condemned Russia's invasion of a sovereign neighboring country.
But now we have the United States buying oil from Russia.
Which is equally bad, that certainly doesn't go down well in Europe either.
Right.
But what the Europeans would expect is a clear distancing from Russia and also condemnation of the invasion. I think that actually would improve Chinese-European relations a lot if China moved in that respect.
Okay, let's go to Klisman Murati. Klisman, great to have you with us. In the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, we saw the problems that the entire world faced as far as global chains were concerned. We now have the China-Europe Railway Express, which has been something of a game changer as far as the supply chain to Europe and to China has been concerned. It's cut down delivery times to something like 3 weeks compared to shipping routes. And now, of course, as Einar mentioned earlier on, we have problems in the Red Sea with shipping there. So how do you think this land link, this China-Europe Railway Express, will shape Europe-China trade?
Well, that's just one of the innovations between the EU and China, which naturally had taken a long time for it to negotiate to get to the point that it is. But there's a lot of fundamental differences between the approach of global governance, for example, that both the EU and China stand really at opposite sides of. The EU is led by, they're both led by values, I suppose, whereas the EU has a much more holistic view on introducing human rights as part of the conversation when it comes time to investment and trade. Whereas China doesn't want to have that conversation, not for a good or bad reason, but their own point of view is that we need to grow our economy. We're focused on internal growth dynamics, and we need external partners to help us do this. And this is one of the main contention points when it comes time to forging a path forward, despite this innovation in trade that you discussed. Also, we have externalities which will impact the EU-China relations. We mentioned the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, what's happening there. And I think this is an area where, sort of in secondary ways, both China and the EU can work together to solve, or to at least help solve, the disputes in that part of the world, to engage further and to build goodwill amongst each other when it comes time to developing good diplomatic and trade relations. We mentioned the summit, EU summit with China in December, which was, I think, by all accounts, a failure. And they're hoping to build upon this, but if they don't crack the code of how do they move forward in terms of value-based politics, I think this will remain stagnant. Although business will continue, I think politically it will remain stagnant.
Einar, Tangen, what is your view on what Klisman told us, that to some extent the relationship is determined by ideology, by politics?
Well, yeah, I'm going to differ with him sharply on this. If the EU is so interested in values, where is their strong leadership and voice on Hamas? This idea that somehow China is supposed to be helping Europe when Europe is lagging the world. This has nothing to do with China. At 1.2%, literally, Europe is dragging down the world average. Growth has shifted to sub-Saharan Africa, which has 6 of the top 10 economic hotspots. China is going to be at 4.8. It's 3.5 times. EU will be 3.5 times less. The EU's problem, especially Germany, was that their cheap energy was in essence destroyed by this Ukrainian situation, which for many, not just in China, but in the third world, believe was avoidable. So this idea that somehow China is responsible for actions that were taken by the U.S. and Europe is not constructive. But at this point, a lot of things are going to change. The EU Parliament is going to have elections next year. I think you're going to see people who are a lot more pragmatic coming in. The people of Europe are interested in growth, opportunity. They're tired of being played. This idea that they should suffer while the U.S. continues to, as it was pointed out, buy uranium. They doubled the order, and now buying oil from Russia. What does that mean? The U.S. is supposed to be the value-oriented country in the world which Europe is clinging to, but it seems that they're on opposite sides at this juncture.
And Klaus, getting back to the relationship in terms of development and cooperation, China is hoping to partner with the European Union. The EU has something called the Global Gateway, which it describes as an infrastructure partnership. Of course, we know about China's infrastructure initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you see some kind of synergy between these two, which will benefit the whole world?
It would, but at the moment it's difficult to see. I think the Global Gateway was developed in response to what China is doing with the Belt and Road Initiative. It was decided that Europe and the United States, but largely Europe, could not leave Africa and other developing parts or countries of the world to China, that the Europeans had to have an influence there as well, and bring their own standards and their own values into that Global Gateway infrastructure program. Theoretically, some cooperation would be possible. I'm sure that will be discussed, but at the moment that doesn't seem to be the case. And that was not the original intention why the Global Gateway was set up. However, I think it might be a good way forward if there was agreement on standards, on values, and how to do it.
Yeah, and Klaus, if we look at the current trajectory of the relationship, both sides want improvements, both sides see benefits for each other. So how does one explain things like Italy initially joining the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and then withdrawing?
Well, there have been problems with the Belt and Road Initiative. Some of the projects which were promised, which were started, did not come through. It's not the hopes have been disappointed. And I think Italy was one of the countries which got disappointed and it decided to withdraw. The same applies to the Baltic states, who once were quite enthusiastic about various cooperation mechanisms with China, like the so-called 17+1. And that didn't work out in their view, so they withdrew. In a way that is not really all that surprising. Why should countries not join an initiative? If they feel the initiative is not productive, they withdraw again. Of course, China probably saw that as a bit of a humiliation, but I think that is international politics.
Wasn't it also driven a little bit by ideology with the change of government in Italy?
Yes, but it is a right-wing government which is fairly independent, though it's much to everyone's surprise it is actually more pro-European than anyone expected. So everyone is quite relieved about that within European capitals. But I think that government is independent enough that it would cooperate with China if it believed it was to its own advantage.
Right. John Gong, where do you see the potential for the most growth in this relationship between China and Europe? In fact, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, she has said, and I'm quoting her here, she said, China is the EU's most important trading partner. In fact, in 2023, China took over the United States as the EU's most important trading partner. So how does this expand?
Well, I think, I don't take too much really seriously with her statements. I mean, she shifts from here to there, jumping back and forth, though it's not very consistent. But anyway, I think she does have a point that the relationship between China and the European Union is fundamentally complementary in this trade relationship. And I think, from China's perspective, European Union still is a very large trading partner to China. I think more importantly, the European companies that operate in China are actually very successful. If you look at I give you one example. The Europeans have been complaining about electric car exports to the continent. Clearly, I think this concern is coming from the fact that the European automobile industry is totally lagging behind the Chinese automobile industry. I mean, one very good example is these politicians visit the auto show in Munich, and they all got away, really freaking out and scared about the prospect of totally being defeated by Chinese cars. But if you look at the European automakers right now, the company that has really benefited from the electrification movement here in China, that have really, trying to catch up with this trend, is actually German companies operating very successfully in China. Volkswagen, for example, it has a joint venture in China's Anhui province with an automaker. It's making electric cars. It's hiring electric car engineers here in China. And actually, the electric cars made by Volkswagen in China are exported back into the European market. So clearly, I think this is a very good example of how European companies not just benefiting from making money here in China, but also improving themselves. Also in terms of improving themselves, also in terms of making themselves more competitive by participating in the Chinese market. So I think aside from all this talk about competition, systematic challenge, stuff like that, I think overall the relationship is beneficial to both sides, particularly to the European side as well. So I don't really see this as us against them kind of relationship, and I think there are room for cooperation. And I also want to emphasize again that on the issue of Ukraine, I think there's going to be less disagreement given what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, as well as the future direction of how this war is going.
Klisman Murati, on this whole question of the auto industry, especially the EV auto industry, as John points out, there have been advantages for both sides. Companies in both countries, or in China as well as in the EU, have seen the benefits of this. But now the EU has opened an investigation into Chinese subsidies for the EV industry. There's also talk of adopting some kind of a de-risking strategy, something we hear about very often here in the United States. But there are many countries, 11 countries, in fact, those countries include France, Germany, and Spain. They don't agree with de-risking. So where does the relationship go? I mean, are EU countries now vulnerable in a certain way? I mean, we just had the European Central Bank warn us that the Eurozone is heading for another economic downturn.
Yeah, that's true. I think there's 2 points to make on this point. Number one is that the EU isn't one homogeneous body. There's 27 nation states with their own agendas, their own aims, and their own strategies in which to get what they want to get. And they use the vehicle of the EU to obviously try to get their needs met. So naturally, there's going to be disagreements as to what even the term de-risking means and how that's applied to each individual country. And what they're laid in there is they're representing the EU's voice as a whole, but within sort of the castle walls of the EU, there's fierce debate as to how they approach China and what benefits they see from China. On China's side, I made it clear before that China's main aim is to grow their economy, to make sure unemployment reduces, and also to essentially be a more advanced and more technically capable Germany, i.e. having technological development in manufacturing so that they can take advantage of cheap labor and also the ability to innovate within the borders of China and to export these innovations across the world. When this happens, this naturally comes up against current dominant players, i.e. the car manufacturing industry in Germany, and there's going to be schisms that appear when you have a rising power when it comes down to manufacturing coming into contact with an already established power. So the Thucydides trap in business, if you will. So that's something that we can't avoid because China's aims are very clear. And in terms of them working together, I think this is going to be difficult because it's a zero-sum game, the way I see it. Either the Germans sell more cars or the Chinese sell more cars into the EU market.
Einar Tangen, the Chinese Premier Li Qiang, he will be at the World Economic Forum that is next week. The theme this year is rebuilding trust. Would it be fair to say that there is a pretty serious trust deficit right now? So how big a challenge is that going to be, rebuilding trust?
Well, as our two European guests have amply demonstrated, there is a massive trust deficit. How to build it? It can only be built over time and action. And what has to happen is Europe has to figure out how to do it. I reject this idea that it's a zero-sum game. The fact is that Germany sells a tremendous number of cars into China. If it was to lose that, it would be half its profits and 1/3 of its total. So this idea that it's either I win or you win, that works for the United States, but that wasn't something that was typical for European thinking. So yes, the EU is divided. They have a lot of issues. Companies are moving out, like BASF, and basically discontinued their chemical operations in Germany. But how do you build trust? You build it one brick at a time by action. And I really mean that what they need to do is have people being exchanged back and forth. They need to have trade. They have to get away from the demonization that is occurring at the political and media levels and just see what it is. I mean, China's values are very simple. Come here and you'll see. You can walk the streets safely. There are economic opportunities and also headwinds. But the government is trying its best to make sure that its people do well, but not at the expense of other countries. And unfortunately, that kind of thinking does separate a lot of how China goes at the world, where it's trying to open up, whereas the EU and the US tend to believe that they can dictate. They can say, well, you have a trade deficit, but we're not going to sell you things you want to buy.
Klaus, we've got less than a minute left. What is your view on this whole question of trust or confidence building, as we sometimes...
It's absolutely important. Of course, it helps if there is mutual trust. However, the mutual trust needs to be built on reciprocity. And I think that is what the Belgian Prime Minister and von der Leyen in December mentioned. Both sides have to give something.
Right.
And I think that is lacking at the moment. And here a lot can be done. And I think both sides should cooperate and work towards each other. And then, of course, the trading relationship will flourish. At the moment, we are in a bit of a crisis between Europe and China, but that crisis doesn't need to continue forever.
Yeah, we shall see what 2024 brings.
Indeed.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arund Naidu in Washington, D.C.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers.